Chapter 13. Cecilia Olavsdatter grew and thrived so that the neighbours' wives said they could see a difference in her from day to day. What fattened her no one could guess, for the mother would nurse her at her own breast, and there she could hardly suck many drops of milk. But she grew more in 1 month than other infants in 3, was the boast of Signy and Una. Now and again they poured cream into her, or let her chew at deer's marrow in a cloth. Folk who came out to Hestviken asked to see this little maid, whose fame was already abroad. She was so peerlessly fair. They let it be seen that they wished Olav and his wife well of their happiness. True, there was no one who liked the Hestvik folk very well. Olav was strangely reserved, a man of few friends. Folk thought it a trouble if they had to be in company with this cross-stick, but no doubt this was mostly his manner. One had to admit that in his actions he had always shown himself an upright and pious man, by no means unhelpful either. The wife was incapable and weak-minded, but indeed she wished nobody ill, poor thing. So it was a happy thing, after all, that at last they had gotten a child which looked as if it would grow up. But Ingunn continued poorly for a long time. She must have suffered some hurt in her back, and she could not regain power over her legs, when at last she was up again. Olav came home from church one Sunday. It was such fine weather. That day summer had come. In the fair weather breeze the leaves and green meadows gleamed with light, and every puff of air was like a warm and healthy breath from the growing grass and the new foliage, and from the earth, which still had the moisture of spring within it. When he entered the house and saw Ingunn lying stretched on the bench, he was a little uneasy. Then he said that when they had broken their fast, she must go out with him and look at the good acre. The corn there was coming up so thick and fine this year. This was the field which lay farthest out toward the fjord, under the crags. Olav had a peculiar affection for it, and always chose the best and heaviest corn to sow there. He had fishes' heads and offal from the quay brought there, and it suffered less from drought than was to be expected, for the mould was not very deep, but it was ready for reaping before any of the other fields of Hestviken. Olav had to carry Ingunn over the threshold, and when he had set her down outside the door, he saw that she walked as though she could not lift her feet. She slid them along the ground in short, uncertain jerks, and at the slightest obstacle she nearly fell forward. He took her by the waist, and she leaned heavily against him with one hand on his shoulder. At every third or fourth step she had to pause, and he noticed that she was sweating profusely and trembling with fatigue. On arriving at the lookout rocks, Olav spread his fur-lined winter cloak, which he had brought with him, in a hollow among the rocks. There she could lie in shelter and watch the breeze caressing the young blades of corn, as though currying them, sending flames of light down the green slope. Sea and land were all a-glitter. The summer waves ran in toward the rocks, splashed and trickled back with the pebbles of the beach. The sound of the surf was a gentle murmur. But farther off, under the bull, the spray was thrown higher. The wind was going round to the southwest now. Olav sat following with his eyes a heavily laden trading vessel that was making her way up the fjord, rather fast. He was lost in thought. Old memories floated before him of the time when he was an outlaw and free as a bird, knew nothing of bearing another's burdens. Alone he had been, one man among many others, who were never so near to him that he felt their pressure. It was strangely far away now. After all these years he had had the whole of Hestviken depending upon him, and his sick wife as close to him as his own flesh. He had struggled on with her, who was always infirm and suffering. It was like fighting with one arm hanging broken and useless. Nevertheless, he did not feel unhappy as he sat here in the midday sun. He did not think of the old days in such a way that he wished himself away from the present, or fretted at his lot with Ingunn. He sat and took his rest, in a kind of melancholy, but even that which oppressed him was his infinite affection for her. It seemed too great for him to carry it alone. He turned to Ingunn, was going to say something about the vessel. Then he saw that she had fallen asleep. She looked like one dead. He felt with wonder that he was even fonder of her now than he had ever been before, just because he could see that every trace of her beauty was so utterly destroyed. No one who had not seen her in her youth could imagine that this middle-aged, faded wife had once been fair. She had been lovely, as a pure and delicate flower is lovely. Now the yellow skin, flecked with brown patches, was drawn tightly over her hollow-cheeked and long-chinned face. Her tall and slender form had long lost its willowy suppleness. She was flat as a board over the narrow chest, heavy and shapeless about the waist. She looked like an aged and worn-out cottar's wife who has borne many children. The husband sat and looked at her, not daring to touch her. She must be in need of sleep. He merely took the ends of her linen coif and tucked them in, lest the wind should blow them in her face, and he wrapped the cloak better about her. She looked so bloodless that he must not let her take cold. Both Olav and the housefolk saw that she was less able to walk day by day, and about the time of St. John's Mass she could not get up from her seat without help, nor push one foot before the other without someone to support her. But still they dressed her every morning. It was Thorhild who had to do this now, for Liv, Ingunn's own maid, was fit for nothing at this time. Olaf had never been able to understand Ingunn's obstinate dislike of Thorhild Bjornsdatter all these years. Thorhild was a woman whose match was not often to be met. Loyal, capable and strong, and however unreasonable Ingunn might be with the housekeeper, Thorhild remained as patient and attentive as ever toward her sick mistress. Equally incomprehensible did it appear to Olaf that she should have taken a fancy to this Liv, who had entered her service the year before. For one thing, the girl was almost the ugliest being Olaf had ever seen. At the first glance one was tempted to doubt whether she was human, undersized, hugely broad, and notably squat and bandy-legged. Her red hair was thin and straggling. Her skin was a reddish grey, with freckles over her arms and hands and down to her chest, and her face was marvellously hideous, with little blinking pig's eyes, a pointed nose, and no chin. The lower part of her face slanted in, and made one with the flabby flesh of her throat. Nor was she of kindly disposition, lazy and unwilling with Thorhild and the dairymaid, and exceedingly stupid. But Ingunn had set her affection on this girl. When it came out that she had gone astray the autumn before, when she was given leave to go home and visit her parents at Michaelmas, her mistress besought Olaf not to turn Liv out of the house. Olaf had had no such thought. He knew that there was great poverty and many children in the croft from which she came, so it was better for her to stay at Hestviken. But as she was under his roof and very young, 15, he thought he would have to try and see justice done to the girl, and questioned her about the father. But all she knew was that it was a man who had borne her company a part of the way through the forest, when she was going home at Michaelmas. "And did he maltreat you then?" asked Olaf. "No, no." Liv beamed all over her face. He had been so merry and kind. John, he said, was his name. "Ha, so every man is called who has no other name." Now, in any case, she would soon be a fit foster-mother for Cecilia. For it would go ill if the sick mother were to nurse this big and greedy child. But hitherto Ingunn had refused to hear of Cecilia being taken from her breast. Olaf had sent for all the men and women of the country round who had a knowledge of sickness and leechcraft. None could say what ailed the mistress of Hestviken, and most of them thought it must be caused by treachery or envy. Olaf knew that she had been sick in the same way 16 or 17 years before, when she was at Mickelbo, and then Mistress Hilleborg had said it was certain that Kolbein had caused spells or other witchcraft to be put upon her. He wondered whether this might not be true after all, and that she had never been entirely set free from the power of evil. Then he became acquainted with a German merchant, Klaus Wiepart, in Oslo, who was said to be a very learned leech. He had been a captive among the Saracens in his youth and had acquired their knowledge. Olaf fetched him, and this man saw at once what ailed Ingunn. What might have been the origin of it he was not able to say. It might be one thing or another, but most probably it came from the stars. For example, that her husband had first had knowledge of her in an hour when the position of the heavenly bodies was hostile to them, according to the stars under which they had been born. It might be a question of less than an hour. A little before or a little after, the auspices might have been particularly favourable to them. But this might have had such an effect upon her, who was the weaker, as to disturb the harmony in her body between the solid matter and the humours, so that the solid matter had shrunk and the humours had obtained the mastery. She might even have had a disposition toward this disharmony in her hour of birth, but the disharmony was the especial cause of her weakness. The proof of this was that she had not been able to bear children of the male sex that were capable of surviving beyond the first one. For man's body is by nature drier than the woman's, and demands from the very beginning more of the solid matter. But a daughter she had been able to bring forth alive. Even so, this child too had absorbed more solid matter than the mother's body could afford to give up. She was now, Klaus Wiepart would say, in a state of decay, as it were. Bones and flesh were saturated with humours, even as wood floating in the sea becomes soft and full of water. In the first place they must see to getting her body drained of moisture, said the German. The child should by no means be taken from her breast. She must be given sudatory and diuretic medicines. She must drink very little, but take burnt and pounded bones and terra sigillata, and eat hard, dry food with hot spices in it. The learned man's opinion filled Olaf with fresh courage. It sounded so reasonable, and the Latin words used by the German came back to Olaf from his young days. Prima causa, harmonia, materia, and humidus, disparo, dispono. These words he remembered to have heard from Asbjorn Olfat, Arnvid, and the friars at the convent, and, as far as he could judge, Klaus knew them rightly. And then, even before they were grown up, he himself had noticed that Ingunn's body was strangely weak and without firmness. It made him think of green corn. Surely she had always had too little of the solid matter. Terra sigillata must certainly be good for her. It was good for so many things, he knew. And he had learned about the 4 elements of which the human body is composed, and had heard that the position of the heavenly bodies influences a man's destiny. Learned men at home did not know so much about this. Asbjorn Olfat said that Christian men had no need to inquire what is written in the stars. But the Saracens were said to have had more knowledge of the stars than any other folk. Olaf was unspeakably relieved at heart. Perhaps he had been on an entirely false scent all these years. He had always believed it was he who had brought misfortune upon them both, because he dared not break out of the sin in which he lived. He was living in sin, there was no doubt of that, so long as he made no offer to atone for that unhappy deed. But God must know that he could not. He could not jeopardize the wealth and honour of his wife and child. In all else he had endeavoured to walk as a Christian man, and God must know even better than himself how unspeakably he longed to live at peace with him, to be allowed to love him with his whole heart, to bend the knee in prayer without grieving at his own disobedience. But what if he might now believe that all their misfortunes had a natural origin? Cecilia was the pledge that God had remitted his debt, or would give him respite till the hour of death. That the stars had been the cause of Ingunn's weakness in body and soul. But prima causa, that was one of God's names. He knew that. She said herself that she was better for these remedies of Klaus Weipart's. And yet she had not regained sufficient vigour to be able to move her legs, but she felt less of the pain in her back. He came into the cookhouse one evening just before Olaf's Mass. There was something he wished to say to Thorhild Bjornsdatter before he forgot it. She was baking bread for the holy day. The flour dust floating in the air was golden in the evening sun as he opened the door and the light filled the sooty little room. A sweet yeasty scent came from the round loaves that lay baking on slanting stones around the glowing heaped-up fire. Olaf's mouth watered at the smell. The girl was not there. Olaf was turning to go out when Thorhild appeared at the door, carrying a board so heavy that she supported it on her head with both arms. She was obliged to walk even more erect than usual, and in the warm summer evening her light clothing looked well and suitably free. She was in her working clothes, a short-sleeved shift of homespun and bare legs. She was so deft in her movements, firm and strong. Olaf took the board from her. It was of oak and very heavy. He carried it in and laid it on the trestles. Thorhild followed, filled both her fists with chopped juniper from a basket, and spread it over the board. She gave off a fragrance in her rapid movements, of meal and fresh bread, of the healthy warmth of work. Olaf threw his arms about the maid and pulled her roughly to him. His chin came near her shoulder. For an instant he pressed his cheek against her skin. Her neck was dewy, at once cool and warm. Then he let her go and laughed to cover his confusion and shame at this foolish wantonness that had come over him so suddenly. Thorhild had turned red as blood, and the sight of her added to his embarrassment. But she said nothing, and showed no sign of anger, went about quite calmly, moving the loaves that were done from the stones onto the board. "You can lift as much as a man, Thorhild," said her master. And as she did not answer, but went on with her work, he began again more seriously. "You support our whole household. You do more work than all the rest of us put together." "I do my best," muttered Thorhild. "I don't know what to think. Perhaps we might reward you better. If so, you must tell me. We'll soon agree on something." "I am well content with what I have. I have now put all my own out into the world, save the two youngest, and you have helped me well." "Say nothing of that." He gave her the message he had come for and went out. Ingunn continued to use the wise German's remedies, but after a while it was seen that the results were not entirely beneficial after all. She had violent pains in the stomach and burning of the throat from all the pepper and ginger. But she held out as long as she could, struggling to get down the dry and irritating diet, although she seemed to feel the pains even at the sight of the food. She was tortured by thirst day and night, but she bore it all with patience and made little complaint. Then Olav had to be away from home for a few nights, and Sigrid Undset came to sleep with the sick woman meanwhile. Afterwards Sigrid told Olav it was quite wrong that Ingunn should still have Cecilia with her at night. The mother no longer had a drop of milk in her breast, and it was hunger and temper that made the child shriek so wildly at night, keeping Ingunn and everyone else awake. Olav had never known any other infant than Audun, and he shrieked almost continually, so the man thought it was the way of little ones. Now Liv had long nursed Cecilia in the daytime, and her own child was lately dead, and the girl was as full of milk as a dairy cow. The only natural thing was to let Liv be Cecilia's foster mother, and have the child both day and night. But when they spoke of this to Ingunn, she was quite beside herself with grief. She begged and beseeched that they would not take Cecilia from her. "She is all that is left of me. I bought you this daughter at the price of lying here powerless and palsied to the waist. If you love her, Olav, have pity on me. Don't take Cecilia from me the little while I have left to live. It will not be long before you are freed from this wretched life with me." He tried to make her see reason, but she screamed, thrusting her elbows into the bolster under her, raising her shoulders and struggling as though she would force her palsied body to rise. Olav seated himself on the edge of the bed, comforted her as well as he could, but it was in vain. At last she had raged and wept till she was so weary that she sank into a doze, but even in her sleep she gasped and shook. The end was that he promised that she should have Cecilia in bed with her at night, but Liv was to lie on the bench nearby so that she might quiet the child when it shrieked. When he came to say good night to her before he went to bed, she put an arm about his neck and drew his head down. "Don't be angry, Olav. I can't sleep unless I have her with me. I have always been afraid when I had to lie alone," she whispered. "Ever since the first night you slept with me, it has seemed as though I could not feel safe unless I had your arm about me. And now that will never be again." Olav knelt down, took her under the neck, and let her head rest against his shoulder. "Do you wish me to hold you like this until you fall asleep?" he asked. She fell asleep almost at once. Then he arranged the pillows under her shoulders, stole quietly across the floor, and crept into Eirik in the north bed. He kept a little charcoal lamp burning on the hearth at night. He had to get up so often to help Ingunn and turn her. And now he had to get up and take Cecilia too when she shrieked, carry her to the girl. Liv never woke herself. At last he must have fallen asleep and slept heavily. The child must have been shrieking a good while, so persistently as to succeed in waking Liv. In the feeble light of the little lamp, he saw the maid padding about by Ingunn's bed with Cecilia in her arms. She looked so shapelessly broad and squat that he could not help thinking of tales he had heard of ogres and gnomes. Though he knew how foolish it was, it made him uncomfortable to see Cecilia in the arms of this foster-mother. Olav came into Ingunn about midday on the morrow. He and one of the housecarls had been bringing in the hay on pack-horses from some outlying meadows on the high ground. The nap of his short cloak was thickly beaded with drops of mist, and his boots were heavy with wet earth and withered leaves. He gave off a raw scent of autumn as he bent over Ingunn and asked her how she was. With a little embarrassed smile he showed her what he had brought in his hand. some big watery strawberries threaded on straws, as they had used to do when they were children. The berries were soft, so that the palm of his hand was red with them. "I found these up by the mill." Ingunn took them without remembering to thank him. It was these little red spots within his coarse, worn hands, and she recalled their life together from childhood, all the way till now. Twice he had reddened that hand with blood for her sake, and it was the same hard, resin-smirched boy's fist that had helped her over fences and opened to show her gifts. Their life appeared as a tapestry to her, as one long tissue, little images of brief, hot, happy love, with long intervals between of waiting and longing and barren dreams, the time of shame and mad despair, like a big dark spot. And then all these years at Hestviken. All appeared to her in an instant as though embroidered upon a ground, a single fabric, a whole tapestry of the same stuff from their childhood's days until now, until the end. True, she had always acknowledged to herself that Olaf was good to her. She had known in a way that few men would have had patience with her for so long, would have been equal to the task of protecting her and sustaining her all these years. She had indeed thanked him in her heart, thanked him sometimes with burning intensity. But only now did she see, as a whole, how strong his love had been. He was standing by the cradle now. The rockers bumped and bumped against the floor, and the child gurgled and cried with delight, drumming its heels with wild persistence against the skin rug under it. The mother could just see its little pink hands waving above the side of the cradle. "No, Cecilia, don't do that. You will soon strangle yourself in these snares." Olaf laughed and lifted up the child in his arms. She had wriggled so violently that her clothes were quite undone, and the swaddling band had become so tangled about her arms and leg and neck and her little body that it was a wonder she had not strangled herself with it. "Can you get this straight?" He laid the child on the bed by its mother. "Are you weeping?" he asked, saddened. Ingunn was blinded by tears, so that she could scarcely see as she tried to free Cecilia from her bands. "She will be just as fair-haired as the rest of us Hestvik folk," said the father. "And now you have 7 curls." He passed his hand over the child's forehead, where the hair had grown long and curly in little pale yellow locks. "Are you in pain today, my Ingunn?" "It is not that. I am thinking that, though you have been good to me and faithful so long as I have known you, I have never had it in my power to reward you for your affection." "Don't say that. You have been a gentle—" He could not find another word in her praise on the spur of the moment, though he was trying to say something to please her. "You have been a gentle and a quiet wife, and you know how fond I am of you," he said with feeling. "And now it will soon be a year," she whispered, distressed and shy, "that you have been as a widower, with an infirm sister to take care of." "Ah, yes," said her husband softly. "But if I love you, sister, you say. Do you remember, Ingunn, the first years we lived together? We slept in the same bed, drank from the same bowl, and were as brother and sister. We knew of nothing else. But then, too, we were happiest when we were together." "Yes, but we were children in those days. And then I was fair," she whispered with more passion in her voice. "You were. But I fear I was too childish to see it. I believe in those years I never had a thought whether you were fair or not. And I was not a burden on you. I was healthy and strong. Nay, Ingunn. Olaf smiled weakly and stroked her arm. Strong you have never been, my dearest friend. It was a long winter for them at Hestviken. Olaf was at home all the time. He thought he could not leave her for a single night. She now suffered greatly from lying in bed, since she was so emaciated, and then she had got some hurt in her back. When she had lain a while in one position, it felt as if a pain crept over her ribs and filled her whole chest. The only thing they could do to relieve her was to move and turn constantly. She could take no food at all. They kept life in her by giving her gruel, broth and milk, a mouthful at a time. She had tried to do a little needlework as she lay in bed, but her hands became numbed whenever she held them raised a little while, so that she could neither sew nor plait. And then she lay in a doze, altogether motionless. She never spoke a word of complaint, and she thanked them gently when anyone came and turned her or arranged her pillows. Sometimes she slept a good deal in the daytime, but at night she seldom had any sleep at all. Olaf had the fire burning on the hearth all night, and he had shut off the closet with the door to make the great room warmer. The winter was not a very cold one, but all this smoke day and night was troublesome. He watched by the sick woman night after night. Eirik lay in the bed behind his back asleep. Liv slept on the bench, and Cecilia slept in her mother's bed. Olaf lay in a sort of doze, but it was never too deep for him to hear an ember shooting out of the fire, or Ingunn's almost inaudible groans. He was up and beside her in a moment. All that winter he was never out of his clothes, except every washing day when he went to the bathhouse. He knelt beside her bed, laid the palms of his hands under her shoulders, then under her back, and then he held her heels in the hollows of his hands for a while. In his heart he expected with a kind of morbid horror that she would get bedsores there. It was like the last glowing ember of all he had once felt for her body. He thought he could not bear to see the skin broken and the sores eating into Ingunn's flesh while she yet lived. Never had it been so hard for him to endure the sight and smell of wounds and impurities, though he was ashamed of this weakness. But he prayed desperately to God that at least it might not come to this. He asked it as much for his own sake as for hers. He was away tending the fire. "Are you thirsty, Ingunn? Shall I take you in my arms, Ingunn?" Olaf wrapped the bedclothes about her and lifted her up in his arms. He sat with her on the settle before the fire. Carefully he bent the lifeless legs, lay down pillows under her feet on the bench, supporting her hips and back on his thighs as he laid her head to rest on his shoulder. Sometimes she fell asleep when she lay thus in his arms, and Olaf sat by the hour holding her, till he was chilled through about the shoulders, stiff in all his limbs. She woke if he made the slightest movement. Then she extricated a hand from the bedclothes and passed it over his face. "Now I am much better. Carry me back to bed now, Olaf, and go and lie down. You must be tired. I have become a heavy burden for you, Olaf," she said one night. "But bear with me a little. It will not last longer than this winter." He did not deny it. He had thought the same himself. When spring came, it would take her with it, and now at last he was ready to submit to it. But as winter drew to a close, she seemed rather to be slightly on the mend. In any case, she revived sufficiently to ask how things were going on the farm and in the fishery. She listened for the cowbells morning and evening, mentioned her cows by name, and said one day that when spring was fully come, they must carry her out of doors, that she might see her cattle once more. Cecilia was now a very pretty child, and big for her age. Ingunn had great comfort of her in the daytime, but then she had to have leave in with her. At night Cecilia slept with her foster-mother in another house. Ingunn could no longer bear the big, heavy child in bed with her. Cecilia rolled over on her mother in her sleep, and when she was awake she stumped about on the bed and fell heavily over her palsied body. Olav had so little liking for Liv that he avoided the room while the maid was there. He knew, too, that she stole in a small way, and he had more than a suspicion that she was too good friends with Anki, and thus taught the man to pilfer and lie. Aunt Ketel's word had always been untrustworthy, but till now it had mostly been because he had no better wit. What they stole was of no great matter, but he did not like having dishonest folk in his house. And now there was such disorder in the household in many ways. He himself was so tired every day that he could not accomplish everything he ought, and downhill is an easy road. So now he did not see much of Cecilia in the daytime. But by degrees it had come to this, that his affection for his daughter was mingled with a profound soreness. It pained him sharply when he recalled that blue, damp night of spring, when he came home and found her in the cradle. The first time they had laid her in his arm he had believed so surely that she betokened a turn in their fortunes. Cecilia came into the world bringing their happiness with her. He loved this little daughter, but his affection was, as it were, spread within him. It lay at the bottom of his heart, shy and mute. In the first days of her life, her father had often stopped before her cradle and touched her with a couple of fingers playfully and caressingly, full of quiet joy and wonder when he got her to smile. And he had lifted her up and held her to him a moment, in his clumsy, unpractised way. "Cecilia, Cecilia!" Now he usually stopped at a little distance when he saw her being carried from house to house. He smiled at his daughter and beckoned. She never took the slightest notice. The very fact that she was so pretty, and that he recognized in her the fair complexion of his own race, seemed only to increase the father's melancholy. Not much was seen of Eirik now. The 9-year-old boy instinctively kept away from the grown people, whom he saw to be always heavy at heart. He found enough to do about the manor, and only came into the hall to eat and sleep. Olav had to go into Oslo for the Holy Cross Fair in the spring. There he received a message asking him to go to the convent of the preaching friars. The prior had news for him. His friend, Steinfinnsons, had died during the winter. In the middle of last summer he had adopted the professed habit among the friars at Hamar. But by the second week of Lent he died suddenly. No one could say of what. As they went to morning mass, the monk who walked beside him saw that Brother Arnvid turned pale and faltered. But on his asking in a whisper if he was sick, Arnvid shook his head. But when they knelt at verbum caro factum est, his neighbour saw that Brother Arnvid was not able to rise to his feet again, and when the mass was at an end, he lay in a swoon. Then they carried him into the dormitory and laid him on his couch. He moaned a little now and again, but was unconscious. In the middle of the day, however, he came to, and asked in a low voice for the last office. As soon as he had received the sacraments, he fell asleep, and when the monks came from vespers, he was dead, so calmly that the friar who sat with him could not say when he ceased to breathe. The prior told him also that before Arnvid entered the convent, he had disposed of a great part of his treasure to kinsmen and friends, and he had bidden his sons send these 2 drinking horns to Olav Audunsson. But the Steinfinnsons were so unlike other men that they would never leave their home parish, and only when they went down to Hamar for their father's burial had Magnus brought the horns to the convent, and Father Bjarne had been unwilling to send these rare treasures south until he could place them in the hands of one of his own order. Olaf knew the horns well from Mickelbo. They were small but very costly. 2 griffin's claws mounted in silver and gilt. Olaf and his friend had used them on the evenings of high festivals, when they drank mead or wine. They only held drink for one man. The news of Arnvid's death shook Olaf to the heart. He could not bear to stay in town among the other men, but sailed out to Hestviken the same evening. There had been times when he thought of his friend and recalled their last talk together, and it pained him that he had stripped himself so bare to the other. He regretted this weakness so that at times he had doubtless thought it would be easier for him if he heard that Arnvid was no more. And then he felt all at once that this was the last stroke, and now he was no longer capable of fighting against his own heart, now that he knew that not a single other person shared his secret. Alone, he would not be able to keep it any longer. And for the first time he saw the true nature of this friendship. It was he who had taken advantage of the other, and Arnvid had allowed him to do so. He had lied to his friend, and his friend had seen through his untruthfulness. Not only the first time, but always he had told Arnvid what suited himself, even to their last meeting, and Arnvid had accepted it and held his peace. It was always he who had sought support, and Arnvid had supported him, as Arnvid had given to all whatever was asked of him. And the reward they had given him was to scourge him. He had found such rewards as awaits the man who has courage to follow Christ's example. And nevertheless Arnvid had blamed himself, and thought himself an unfaithful follower, whenever he was unable to see his path clearly, and whenever his heart was full of bitterness and contempt for men's baseness, as must at times befall a sinful man, when he ventures to follow where God went before. Olaf stayed at home during the spring sowing, even more silent than usual. But one morning, when he had set his folks to work, he walked back to the houses alone. The sunshine flooded the room through the open smoke vent. The light fell upon the fireless hearth, upon the clay floor, and touched Ingunn's bed. Both the children were with her. Eirik lay with his dark curly head in his mother's arms, and his long legs hanging over the edge of the bed. Cecilia crawled about, climbing up the bedpost, and dropping down with a thump and a little scream of joy upon the lifeless form under the clothes. The little maid had nothing on but a flame-coloured woolen shift. Her skin was pink and white, and her hair had grown so full that it fell in bright flaxen ringlets about her face and neck. Her bright eyes were so blue in the whites that they seemed blue all over, and this gave the charming little face a strangely wide-awake look, like that of an animal. "Your mother cannot bear you to weigh so heavily upon her, Eirik." Olaf took Cecilia and seated himself on the edge of the bed with the girl on his knee. Once he clasped his daughter impetuously, and the child struggled. She was not used to being with her father. Olaf felt how good and firm the little body was between his hands, and the silken hair had a fresh, moist scent. As she was not allowed to get at her mother, she wriggled in her father's arms and tried to reach her brother. Eirik took her, held her under the arms, and tried to make her walk. Cecilia thrust out her round stomach, straddling with her arms and one foot, as she threw her head back and laughed up in her brother's face. Then she humped herself along with wild little kicks, laughing and shrieking. "Goi, goi, goi!" She curled up all her toes under the sole of her foot, which was quite round. As yet it had scarcely trodden the ground. Olaf swept his hand over the bed. It was strewed with half-withered flowers, such as bloom between spring and summer, wild vetch, catchflies, buttercups, and great violets. Ingunn gathered them into a bunch. "They have long come out, I see." Olaf sat looking at the children. They were of rare beauty, the two of hers that had lived. Eirik was a big boy now, tall and slight, with his knife belt on his slender hips. Olaf could see he was handsome. His face had lost its childish roundness. It was narrow and sharp, with a slightly curved nose and a high arched jaw. He was brown-skinned and black-haired, had golden yellow eyes. Could his mother help thinking of whom he resembled? "Take your sister with you, Eirik. Carry her out to leave. There's a matter your mother and I wish to speak of." Ingunn raised the bunch of flowers with both hands to her face and drank in with open nostrils the acrid scent of spring. "Now, my Ingunn," said Olaf in a clear, calm voice, "you shall soon be released from lying here in torment. I have purchased a passage for us in a vessel to Nidaros this summer, to St. Olav, so that you may recover the use of your limbs at the shrine of him, the martyr of righteousness." "Olaf, Olaf, do not think of such a thing. I could never bear the voyage. I would not come to Nidaros alive." "Oh, but you will." The man closed his eyes, smiling painfully. His face had gone pale as death. "For now, Ingunn, now I have the courage to do it. When I come there to the sanctuary, I will confess my sin. Of my own free will, I shall put myself in God's hands, make amends for my offence toward him and toward the law and justice of my countrymen." She looked at her husband in dismay. He went on with the same haggard smile. "The thing which befell you at that time at Micklebow, when you rose from your bed and walked, that must have been a miracle. Don't you think that God can perform another miracle?" "Olaf," she cried, "what are you saying? What is this sin you speak of?" "That I killed Teet. What else? Set fire to the hut where the body lay, and never made confession of it. I have been to confession all these years, have been shriven for everything else, great and small, received Corpus Domini like other Christian men, gone to Mass and prayed and pretended. But now there is an end of it, Ingunn. I will have no more of it. Now I will put my case in the hands of my Creator, and whatsoever he will that I shall suffer, I will thank him and bless his name." He saw the look of terror in her face, and threw himself down by the bedside with his head in her lap. "Yes, Ingunn. But now you shall suffer no more for my sins, if only you will believe. You know that you will be helped." She put her hand under his chin and tried to raise his head. The sun was now shining full upon the bed, upon the crown of his bowed head. She saw that Olaf's hair was quite grizzled. It did not show unless the sun shone straight upon it, as it was so fair in colour. "Olaf, look at me. In Jesus' name, have no such thoughts as these. Don't I have sins enough myself to atone for? Do you remember?" She forced him to raise his face. You are not human. You said that to me that time. You know what I would have done with Eirik if you had not prevented me. Should I cast reproach upon God for thinking I was not fit to bear children? All that winter long I thought of nothing but of stifling the innocent life I felt quickening within me. Olav looked at her in surprise. He had, as it were, never thought she remembered this, much less recalled it as guilt. I may thank God's mercy and nothing else that I have not child murder upon my conscience. And no sooner was I saved from that sin than I went about to do a worse one. God stretched out his hand again when I was already halfway through the gates of hell. I have perceived it long ago. I was not allowed to send myself straight to hell. Every day I have lived since has been alone, a respite given to me to bethink myself and understand. Olav, I do not complain as I lie here. Olav, have you once heard me complain? I know well that God has chastised me, not from unkindness. He who has twice plucked me out of the fire into which I would have thrown myself. Olav stared at her. A light was kindled far in behind his pupils. Unspeakably dear as she had been to him all these years, he had never expected much more thought in her than in an animal, a tender young hind or a bird that can love its mate and offspring and lament its dead young, easily scared out of its wits, helplessly at the mercy of wounds and pain. Never had he imagined he could talk to his wife as to another Christian person, of that which had been growing in his soul for years. Oh, Olav! She took his hand, drew him down, and clasped his head to her bosom. He heard her heart beating violently within the narrow, wasted chest. Don't say such things, my friend. Your sin, 'tis white by the side of mine. You must know that they were long for me, these years, and oftentimes heavy. But now it seems to me they were good in spite of everything, since I lived with you, and you were always good. He raised his face. It is true, Ingunn, that we too have had some good here in Hestviken, in that we were always friends. In sickness and in health I have had you with me always, and you have been dearest to me of all human creatures, in that I grew up away from all my kinsmen and friends, and you were the one with whom I consorted most. Then God was so kind to me, in spite of all, that he gave you to me. And I see now it would have been difficult for me to prosper here, had I dwelt here alone, without a single person that I had known from my youth. You see, then, it is for that I can no longer bear to be God's enemy. Of my own will I will no more live apart from him, let it cost what it may. I am no poor man either. There too God spared me. He gave success to many of the enterprises I undertook to better our fortunes. I own more now than when we came together. And you know that by our marriage bond half our estate is yours, whatever may befall. You and your children will not be unprovided for. Don't speak that way, Olav. It cannot be so grievous a sin that you slew Teet. I have never told you this before. I never made complaint of it to any soul, but he took me by force. He raped me. I could not bring myself to say it. It was a thing I could not bear to speak about. She sobbed aloud. nor was I myself innocent. I had borne myself so that he must have thought I was not above such things. I never thought it would end the way it did, and then he forced me. 'Tis true, Olav, I swear." "I know it." He put out his hand as though to stop her. "He said it himself, and I know that this slaying was a small matter in the beginning, had I declared it at once. But I took the wrong road at the start, and now the guilt has grown, and I see it will go on and breed new guilt. And now I must turn about, Ingunn, else I shall become the worst of inhuman wretches. It has come to this, that I scarce dare utter 3 words, for I know that 2 of them will be untrue." She laid her arm across her face, wailing low. "You know," said Olav, trying to quiet her, "it is not certain either the Archbishop will demand that I accuse myself before the king's judges. Perhaps he will think it enough that I confess my sin before God. I have heard that some men have been given absolution for the gravest of sins, without being forced to destroy all their kinsfolk honour and welfare. They were made to do such penance as a pilgrimage to Jerusalem." "No, no," she cried out again. "You would be sent away from us, to the world's end." "But it is not impossible." He laid his hand on her bosom to quiet her. "That I might come home to you again, and you know you would dwell here and possess Hestviken." "But then it would come out that Eirik is not your son." Olav said quietly, "I have thought about that too, Ingunn, and it held me back, so long as I had no child of my own by you. Whether you might be driven out of Hestviken with your son by my remote heirs. But now there is Cecilia. You can adopt the boy to full inheritance in your share of the estate, and he would have a rich sister beside him." "Olav, do you remember what you said yourself? That you had made Eirik no more than amends for his father's death?" "I remember. But I see now, Ingunn, that I had no right to do it. Give away my daughter's inheritance as amends to the child of a stranger." "Cecilia! Olav, Cecilia will be a rich maid for all that. She is rich and born in honour, of noble race. She will be fair besides. She will not be among the unfortunate, if she must be content with sister's share after you." Olav's face was stiff and closed. A child of such birth as Eirik's has no right to amends for his father. "You have always hated my bastard." She burst into a wild fit of weeping. "Yes, I have heard you call him that." "Oh, I know. It is a bad name that may escape the lips of an angry man, even when he speaks to one who is true-born." He made an effort to speak calmly, but could not help showing a touch of bitterness. "But I will not deny I have regretted it. It were better I had called the boy another name when he vexed me." "You hate him," said the mother. "That is not true. I have never been too hard with Eirik. God knows he has had less of the rod than he needs. I cannot do it when you look at me as though I stabbed you with a knife, if I do but speak a little harshly to him. And you spoil him yourself." "I, who lie here and see nothing of the boy from morning till night?" She had picked up the flowers and was pulling them to pieces. "Weeks pass, and he never comes to see his mother, has no time to speak to me. Like today. You came at once and drove him out." Olav said nothing, But if Eirik is to suffer for my misdeeds, then it had been better he had not come living into the world, though I myself should have suffered death and perdition for it." "Be reasonable, Ingunn," her husband begged her gently. "Olav, listen to me. Olav, have pity. Too dearly will you have bought my life and my health, if on this account you should wander through the world a poor and homeless pilgrim in the lands of the black men, among wicked infidels. Or if the worst should happen, that you should be forced to stand naked and dishonoured, in danger of your life maybe, be called caitiff and murderer for the sake of that man. You, the best among franklins, upright and gentle and bold." "Ingunn, I am not that man any longer. I am a traitor to God and men." "You are no traitor. It cannot be a mortal sin that you made away with that man. And you don't know how it feels to have to bend beneath shame and dishonour. I know it. You have never tried what it is to be disgraced. I cannot. No, so help me Christ and Mary, I cannot have this brought upon me again. Even if I were granted life and the use of my limbs, and I should feel that everyone who looked upon me knew of my shame. What manner of woman you had brought home to be Mistress of Hestviken, and my Eirik, a base-born boy without rights or family, whom a runaway, outlandish serving man had begotten on me, tempting me among the woolsacks in the loft, as though I had been a loose-minded, man-mad thrall-woman." Olav stood and looked at her, white and stiff in the face. "No. Were I granted life to suffer in such a way, to stand up and walk with this to face, with your little Cecilia and my bastard holding my hands, and you away from us three, all of us equally defenceless, then I should surely regret the time I lay here waiting for my back to rot away." She stretched out her arms to him. Olav looked away. His face was immovably stiff, but he took her hand in his. "Then it shall be as you wish.